Thanks everyone for joining us for the monthly Tennessee Valley Wild Ones program. Tonight we will hear from Mark Pistrang, but first let's start with just a little bit about Zoom. So Mark will be presenting later, and folks are welcome to ask questions. If you open the chat box, it's at the bottom of your screen, so you can click on that chat feature and the participants feature if you like, and enter questions as we go along. We'll take breaks to answer those questions. You can also raise your hand at any point. That's another feature that you can find in the participants box, or with the little reactions icon. So I can watch out for those as well to help folks get their questions answered as we go. Couple other features to remember: keep muted tonight unless it's a time to ask questions, and then you're welcome to ask out loud when we're ready for questions. You're welcome to turn off your video at any time if you need to move around. And I think that's it for Zoom. So I'll just say again, if you're just joining us, we're going to hear from Mark Pistrang, environmental planning and decision making on the Cherokee National Forest. We're going to have a couple announcements real quick. If anybody has announcements, please feel free to chime in. Otherwise, I'm going to just run through our newsletter real quick. Just so everyone knows, Tennessee Valley Wild Ones has an excellent newsletter, a monthly newsletter, so it doesn't clog up your inbox too much. It's really an excellent roundup of our events, but also other events going on in the area. So I really encourage you to visit our website and get subscribed to that if you're not already. You can go to our website at tnvalleywildones.org. A lot of resources on our website, upcoming events. So the next monthly presentation we have on the calendar is called Surprising Medicinal Stories of 5 Native Plants, and that will be with Erica Gallatin. So that will be in June 14th. We've got some members hikes coming up, and that is for members only. So if you're not a member, consider joining. We do a lot of free programming, but we do have exclusive things just for members. So Rock Creek hike sounds really exciting with Stephen Esselgroth, and Shakerag Hollow, gorgeous sites, love these hikes. We have a Landscapes in Progress coming up in May, so that's a great chance to see other people's gardens, talk about problems you're having, see what kind of solutions they have found with native plants. It's not a fancy garden tour, it's just landscapes in progress, right? You're seeing what other people are struggling with, and yep, that thing died, or there's some privet over there I'm going to get to eventually. So it's really helpful to see other people's land. I feel like great opportunity. And of course, we have certificate in native plants programs coming up as well. So please check that all out on the website. Any other announcements that I missed? Anybody want to plug anything else going on with Wild Ones or locally? Anything else? I know Reflection Writing has got plants going on, plant sale at Reflection Writing. Not so many natives, but Crabtree is definitely selling veggies. Any other announcements? All right. Well, with no further ado, please let me welcome Mark Pistrang. He is the forest botanist ecologist for the Cherokee National Forest, and he has worked there for over 20 years. Prior to that, he was the district botanist for the Cowlitz Valley Ranger District on the Gifford Pinchot National Forest in Washington State. Mark has dedicated his career to promoting environmental conservation and restoration, and he's going to share a little insight into how this is accomplished over in Cherokee National Forest. Thank you so much for coming. We've been looking forward to this.
Thanks for having me. I take you can hear everything good. We're good to go.
Yep, you sound great.
Okay. Well, yeah, no, I appreciate the invite to come and talk. And part of the reason that I get kind of stimulated to participate in these kind of things is just to show maybe a different facet of national forest management. You know, I think a lot of times people in the public, if you're not directly involved with national forests and their management, you just hear about timber sales and you know pipelines that are going through and a lot of things oftentimes that you know maybe had a negative environmental effect and you know there have been those things over the years without a doubt, but there's also a tremendous amount of really cool stuff that goes on. And so you know when you asked me if you know if I was interested in giving this presentation and coming up with topics, I thought you know why not go into this sort of environmental planning, you know, how get kind of from an inside view, how do we approach environmental planning and decision making um, on the Cherokee National Forest, and in particular, trying to figure out how to make my slide advance it. Yeah, how do we manage for diversity? You know that we actually have a lot of goals here on the Cherokee National Forest specifically to look at the biodiversity that is so unique to this region. So I'm going to talk just kind of broadly about a couple of different things, but I want to give some insight into the forest planning process, um, both the very broad scale planning that we do and some project specific planning. And then we'll get into some examples of projects, some restoration work that we're doing in dry forest communities, um, non-native invasive plant species management. I know you were talking about that earlier. I think there's been some probably some workshops and other stuff, but you know, a big issue that we deal with, um, and then a native plant materials program that is fairly unique for this area. And there, I'll go through a few others. Those three I'll talk about in a little bit more detail, but I'll go through some other examples of the types of things that we're doing. Um, but you know, just to kind of start, you know, you look out at a large landscape, and the Cherokee National Forest is 650,000 acres. How do you manage all of this? You know, if you have this multiple use mandate that the Forest Service has, so you're managing it for products. You know, timber products, lumber. It's a real product that is needed and used in the U.S. And so we're trying to do this in a sustainable way. So how do you manage all of this landscape for products, but also for recreational activities? Everything from you know the folks that just want to go on a really quiet solitude walk, or you know there's places where people are riding motorized vehicles. What about clean water? You know, it's a big mandate of the National Forest is we're one of the greatest sources of clean water in the U.S. So how do we manage all of these things together? And yeah, then the thing that's kind of near and dear to my heart, what about all the rare plants and the biodiversity? How do you do all of that at the same time? And it becomes kind of a daunting process. And so, you know, we're the federal government, so of course we have plenty of pertinent laws, policies, and direction. And this is a little bit of tongue in cheek here, but it's also real. Is that there is no shortage of policies and laws and acts and things that guide what we do, and we have to somehow make sense of all of this stuff. So you got this whole myriad of pertinent laws, policies, and direction. And what we do then is we take all of that and we boil it down into Forest Service direction. So how do you take all that national policy, all the laws and directives that were on that last slide, and boil it down into some kind of Forest Service management direction? And over the years, there's been a fair bit of paper dedicated to that, as you can see here. And then, but what's really important is as of January 2004, that was the last time the Cherokee National Forest revised their land and resource management plan. So that document is really this kind of summary of all of the policy that guides what we need to do on the National Forest. And it's broken down into three broad categories. we talk about forest-wide direction. These are anywhere you're standing on the forest, a particular directive would apply. So these are kind of hierarchical. And then management prescription direction, I'll get into that a little bit, but imagine just the forest now broken down into puzzle pieces of different areas that have different sort of themed prescription direction. And then project level standards. So when you get down into the nitty gritty of actually trying to do project work, what sort of standards do you have to adhere to for that particular project? And so imagine for a minute, instead of that multiple use mandate that I was talking about, imagine a single purpose, and you can look at regulated timber harvest on private lands as kind of a prime example of this. If you've ever flown over some areas and you just see this checkerboard pattern, I don't have to tell you what this term emerging landscape means because you're seeing it there on the screen, right? And so for what they're trying to accomplish, this regulated timber harvest, that single purpose is probably very effectively met with this. But what is that doing to the natural processes that also want to take place on that piece of land? There's all kinds of things that are happening that we on the National Forest, we're multiple use, and we definitely don't want emerging landscapes that prevent natural process from happening. And so those management areas that I was talking about, this looks a little bit busy when you first look at it, but this is a chunk of the Cherokee National Forest, and all those different colored weird shapes are different themed management areas. And within those management areas, we're thinking about how do we come up with activities that might fit that landscape. So kind of in the lower third, you see a couple of these kind of snake-like polygons that go across. Those are major river corridors. And so along those major river corridors, we have a prescription that fits the landscape, that really focuses on scenic integrity and things that the public really want to see when they're on, going along a large river. Minimize user conflict. You really don't want to put that motorized use in the same place that people are trying to seek solitude, right? So we can plan for that. Habitat connectivity, that's a big one, that in that previous slide of the regulated management, you can see there's going to be no connectivity whatsoever, and yet with this sort of model that we're looking at, we can consider things like habitat connectivity for species that need movement. And then again, so think about how this model changes that emerging landscape. You're ending up with something that hopefully is a lot more natural to what would occur on the land absent a lot of human management. So just to kind of step back a little bit, I just want to talk about specifically biodiversity on the Cherokee National Forest. One of those management prescriptions, so that where all those different polygons were that I was telling you, one of those management prescriptions, it's titled 9F, but they're just category numbers that we can put on a map. But it was written specifically to protect rare communities on the landscape. So we have a prescription that's specific to rare communities to make sure that we're maintaining, enhancing, and/or restoring those rare communities. And that landscape approach to conserving biodiversity is really important. It focuses on the need to protect the unique resources, but also recognizes the need to restore native habitats, not only within those unique areas, but maybe in the matrix around them, to maintain some kind of integrity on the landscape. In 1996, a lot of the background that fed into that forest plan that I was telling you about, this comprehensive interagency assessment was done, and it examined the trends in forest health and plant and animal resources on over 37.4 million acres across the southern Appalachian area. Large area, so broad assessment to try to get a sense of what the landscape holds. And one really key fact that came out of that pertains to the discussion that we're having right now is there were 31 rare communities, and I'm not talking about 31 instances, but 31 different types of rare communities that were identified in that analysis area. Each one of those occupying less than 1% on the land base. So imagine we've got these unique habitats, anything from wetlands to rocky bluffs, to shale barrens, all these kind of interesting rare communities, but they represent only 1% of the land base. But then here's the really interesting part of it. 75% of the rare plants and animals in our region occur within those rare communities. So you've got 1% of the land base harboring 75% of the rare plants and animals. And it makes you understand the importance of these small areas on the landscape. And that if you don't consider them, if you just are looking at a broad area and just say, oh, well, there's, a couple hundred acres that we can do some work in, and you're not thinking about some small inclusions that might be in there, you can imagine the tremendous negative impact you could have on biodiversity if you're not paying attention to this fact. It goes both ways. By protecting them, it doesn't take a lot of effort because it's a small piece of the land base. But by ignoring them, you can disproportionately cause a real problem to the biodiversity on the land base. So really, really important piece of information that came out of this assessment. And, not just rare communities, but just unique habitats. And so if you've ever taken a walk in the Southern Appalachian Mountains, if you've come to the Cherokee National Forest, you know that there's just a tremendous number of unique habitats. And, we have over 100 distinct vegetative communities that either potentially occur on the Cherokee National Forest. That's a lot. And so each one of those different plant communities is harboring some unique things that go with it. Back to this, and just in the sense of scale, so going back to this map of prescription areas, this isn't going to look very good on the screen, I imagine, that you're seeing, but the point that I'm trying to make here is you see the little call-out box that says Bullet Creek area, and it's pointing to one of those 9F areas. It's so small that at this scale, it doesn't even show up on the map because these areas are really small on the landscape, 1%. But if you zoom in to just like a topo scale, here's that same area, 216 acres of really unique wetland habitats on the Cherokee National Forest. And so within that area, again, management activities are only allowed if they're designed to maintain, enhance, or restore the rare community values. So that's where I was saying, if you were just trying to look at a broad management activity across an area, you might not pay attention to the smaller area that's in it. But now we have policy on the forest that says we need to look for these things, and we need to act differently when we find them. Make sure that anything we're doing would either maintain, enhance, or restore. So any activity that's going to take place within this particular site needs to do that. Are there any, I'm just pause, I'm going to go through some examples here, but I thought if there's any questions that have come up in the chat or anyone just has any thoughts on that, I'm happy to entertain. I want to keep this informal, so if there's anything.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have one question so far, and if anyone else has a question that they would like to say out loud, they're welcome to do that as well. So one question we've gotten from Bill, he asked, so how has the 1% with 75% of the rare plants within that 1%, how has that changed, do you think, since the 1996 study?
I would say that's a good question, and I would say that on national forest lands, I think we're doing a pretty good job of maintaining. Now, what happened prior to forest plan revision and times that we really started focusing on this? So from 1996, our forest plan was revised in 2004. Without a doubt, I think over the years we've seen some losses to some biodiversity, and we continue. I think where we really struggle, we were talking, before we had a little informal chat before this started about the pressures that public lands face from external sources. What seems like a big area really isn't when you start thinking about the onslaught of invasive species and things like climate change. And, so there's some things that we can control and there's some things that we really can't. There's not a lot right now that we're able to do. If we're seeing the highest elevation sites that, where species were really in a refugia that need that high elevation moisture and cool temperatures, if they're starting to see, if they're desiccating because of warmer temps and things like that, that's right now there's not a lot we can do. I don't know, I don't have examples that that's happening, but I would have to say that I think there are some losses, but I think that it's been really encouraging to me to see the Forest Service and other land management agencies, federal land management agencies, and state as well, doing things to protect these unique sites. So I think we're still doing pretty well. I don't think we have a lot of, I don't think we've seen, complete extirpations or definitely not extinctions as a result of that.
Great, thanks. Yeah, any other questions? I was going to ask what kinds of invasives you guys are dealing with, but you might get into that later.
Yeah, I'll show just a few. I have a whole I have a whole presentation I do.
I'm sure.
Pretty much you name it. If you're familiar with invasives in the region, there's some that maybe you see more in different parts of the state that we don't see so much in the national forest. But no, there's just a whole litany of them that we deal with.
Yeah, I guess I was wondering in terms of the rarer plant communities, since sometimes those spring up because the conditions of the site are so unusual, and invasives are generalists. So it's interesting. Sometimes I think it's interesting to see like what species can fill just any niche. Just
Right.
um,
Well, yeah. So the invasive Microstegium viminium. It's a grass.
mhm.
Nepalese brown top. It's got a variety of names. It's one that has this really wide ecological amplitude, so it tolerates full sun, full shade, wet, dry. You show me a forest road, I'll show you a Microstegium type of thing. It's everywhere, and so it's a very difficult one to deal with. And I do have a little flow chart later where I talk a little bit just about our invasive strategies. But in situations like that, I'm only going to really spend resources on dealing with that species if it's threatening a unique site, because it's so ubiquitous. You
Yep,
can spend all your time working on it and not really achieve stuff. So it's kind of like triage. You got
yep.
to figure out where to really focus your resources. But yeah, there's lots.
Great. Any other questions? All right, we'll pick back up with those
Yeah,
in a bit.
yeah. So that example I showed you of the Bullet Creek site, which was like 200 something acres. What we did in our forest plan, then we mapped at the time of that plan, we mapped 26 sites, and we actually utilized the state natural heritage program and some other people to really analyze the unique sites we had in the forest. And this was their recommendation of the 26 best sites that they thought we had on the national forest. And we didn't really give them a number. It wasn't like we just chose 26. They came up with sort of, a partner group with specialties came up with these 26 sites that they said, these are really some of the best sites you have on your forest. So we mapped those 26 sites that represent about 6,500 acres under this rare community prescription. And it's really funny, but that represents 1% of the Cherokee National Forest land base. 650,000 acres, and our rare communities that were determined to be the ones that we really need to focus on were 1% of that. So I thought that was interesting. It sort of bore out to that same number. But again, recognizing that you got to look at the landscape scale first and understand where those things are, because you want to maintain the distribution of those on the landscape and to maintain that ecological integrity of having those, but then also the matrix in between them to make sure you don't have so many negative influences on those really small sites. And because of the fact that they have so much biodiversity in those small areas, they serve as core areas for the conservation of biodiversity. So our forest plan is really built around multiple use, and there's all these other things, but we have a component, landscape level planning, that was designed specifically to look at maintaining biodiversity on the landscape as we do these other activities. And I think that's a pretty cool approach to doing this kind of stuff. So I'm going to go through some examples. Just, I think probably a lot of folks know these, but wetlands. So these aren't necessarily all going to be rare communities, but certainly a lot of the wetland types are. But wetland communities tend to be very big diversity in very small packages. And so from some of this regional analysis that was done, there's something like 350 plus species of viability concern that are associated with wetlands in the southern Appalachian region. So a lot of rare species. You got Platanthera integralabia, which is a federally listed orchid, is the white one on the top, and then a viability concern Platanthera species below. And on a size of scale, this little area, so this looks like this deep dark seep. You see cinnamon fern in there, and if you look closely on that slide, you can see one of the flowering orchids right in the middle, kind of above that log, little patch of white. This area is probably 12 by 12 square feet. It's really small. It's a little associated wetland seep on the side of kind of an ephemeral transitioning to a perennial drain, surrounded by xeric pine forest. And so you can imagine, again, if how easy it would be to destroy a site like this. And this is a site that harbors a federally listed species. So wetlands are really, really unique habitats. Rich cove forests, 43 species of viability concern associated with these types of forests in the southern Appalachian region. And if you've hiked, the Cove Trail in the Chimneys and the Smokies, you're familiar with this really rich habitat that's full of microhabitats, all these downed logs and boulders and all these different kinds of things that create little small microhabitats for lots of species to proliferate. At our highest elevations, we do have some northern hardwood forests. You go up north, and this is not a rare thing at all, but down here it most certainly is. And there are 23 species of viability concern associated with these forests. Even just our riparian forests, streamside forests, 142 species viability concern associated with riparian forests. So you start to see like the value of some of these. And if you've ever even just looked at the smallest little stream, the picture there at the bottom, it's just like barely seeping some water, and yet the amount of biodiversity that you find in these areas is phenomenal. I can spend a long time along a really short stretch of a little high elevation or upper watershed seep because there's so much diversity there, and they're really important to protect. Just a few other important habitats. The high elevation Rocky Summit, some of our highest elevations in the Blue Ridge, at least the southern Blue Ridge. There's a federally listed lichen that's up on Roan Mountain. Lots of different non-vascular plant species and lichens. The mountain balds, like up at Roan Mountain, a whole bunch of unique refugia species that you find there. And then spray cliffs and humid gorges. If you've ever gone around the base of a waterfall and looked at the really unique non-vascular mosses and liverworts, we have a lot of diversity, a lot of rare species that are overlooked by most people, but it's really cool to get out and start looking at some of these things. But like I mentioned before, it's kind of the easy thing is to protect a small area, right? That doesn't take a lot. You just say, man, we identified this little area, we're just going to be hands off. But protecting the existing rare community is only part of it. Understanding and managing the abundance and distribution of all those native habitats is also important. And this is kind of the part that I'm going to focus a lot of the rest of this on, is I refer to it as like the matrix of forest that's in between all those little tiny rare spots, right? You've got a little, maybe less than an acre rare community, but then you've got this large expanse of, everything from, mesic oak to xeric pine forest, all just transitioning across the landscape. But understanding that abundance and distribution of that, and is that in good health? If we allow that to deteriorate, then what's going to happen to that rare community that was adjacent to it? So it's really, really important to focus on that. And one of the primary themes of our revised land and resource management plan is the restoration of vegetative communities. So we actually have a mandate to understand the health of the forest that we're dealing with. And so, I put this in, if the current condition of our forest shows a reduction in the distribution, quantity, or quality of important habitats, then we have an opportunity to restore them. Honestly, I think we have an obligation to restore them, right? The opportunity is certainly there, but it's an obligation. We're land managers, and we want to have the healthiest forests that we can have out there. But, so how do you go about doing that? It's, my job as an ecologist, I have a good idea of what a healthy plant community looks like, but, some people wouldn't necessarily know that. But we have ways of doing that, and I'll show you just the briefest example of some modeled data that we've used. But I'm going to move now into just some examples of some current restoration projects that we have. I think, did someone just ask a question in the chat? I got a little note on my top of my computer.
Yes, sorry, had to unmute.
No,
Yes, we got
that's
another question. If you'd like to hear it now. Bill says the large old trees provide the most carbon sequestration and the largest impact on long-term forest quality. How does the harvesting plan protect large trees? You can't restore a 300 to 500-year-old oak in a few decades. So yeah, so we were recently learning a little bit about some forest management in our symposium, and just talking about different methods for managing forests for timber at the same time as biodiversity.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and thankfully I think a pretty good answer for it. We actually have we have old growth standards that are built into our plan, and we have areas that are set aside to some degree to allow to continue to become old growth. The forest plan has a whole section in it on what they call large, small, and medium-sized patches, and some of the areas. So for example, like the riparian areas, we have a lot of areas on the forest that, because of the land classification that was given to it through the forest plan, they're considered unsuitable for timber harvest. So we have large areas on the forest that we're not going to do commercial harvest on, that we fully anticipate will get to old growth condition. We also have, as we're doing work within certain stands, we're looking for the types of trees that we want to maintain on the landscape. And old growth or older trees, not only do they help with the carbon sequestration and the things that you mentioned, but just den trees for bears and such wildlife habitat that they provide. It's really interesting if you follow. So when I was working out in the Pacific Northwest, that like in very early successional, when a land is cleared, there's a lot of species that grow, a lot of the various legume species that fix nitrogen. So they'll actually fix nitrogen and bind it into and it helps restore the soils. It's a natural process that happens. So you have that in these very early successional stands. But what's really cool is when you get into the Pacific Northwest true old growth stands, there's also a bunch of nitrogen fixing lichens that you find only in this oldest stage. As these stands are literally getting to the point that they're falling apart, they're finding ways to sequester nitrogen and fix it in these lichens that can then, if that stand is damaged, those things are going to go, and you've got that nitrogen component that can go into the soil. So no, it's a good question, and it's one that it's been a big issue, I think, in forest management for a long time, is that notion of rapid turnover of stands and just never letting them get old. Our forest plan definitely features, recognizes the value of old growth and puts an emphasis on it across the landscape, just like we do with the rare communities.
Great, thanks.
Yeah. So some examples of some of these restoration projects that we're working on. Like I said, I kind of get into some of these now. One I'll talk about a little bit is the restoration of dry forest communities that are departed from natural condition. And so again, back in that slide a minute ago, I talked about, like, I can recognize as a trained ecologist when a stand isn't in very good health. But one of the things that we've seen, from decades of fairly intensive land use, and then the complete exclusion of fire, where we're just putting out, we never allow fire to burn. There's a lot of species that would occur on ridge tops and south-facing slopes. Those are the areas that those are our driest sites, right? They get the most solar incidence, ridge top, south-facing slope. And they also receive the most natural fire from lightning strike because they're at the highest, ridge tops. And so by preventing fire from ever getting to those areas, we see a lot of these species that wouldn't tolerate any kind of fire creeping up onto those landscapes. And so there's actually two species of native pines, Virginia pine and white pine, that are both natural on the landscape, but become almost like an invasive species to some extent on some of these dry sites. So I'll talk a little bit about the restoration of our dry forest communities that are departed, the treatment of invasive species and how we can restore native habitats, restoration of aquatic systems, and some native wildlife habitat management. I'm really only going to focus on the first two with the specific examples, but I've got a few examples here just to show you. So top left and the big picture on the right, the top left is a monoculture of Virginia pine up on a dry ridge. And you can see there's no mid-story, there's no shrub layer, there's no herb layer, it's just Virginia pine. And likewise, on this other picture on the right, there's a fairly large shortleaf remnant on the site there in the front, but this area had probably been harvested in the past and then left without a whole lot of follow-up treatment. And now you have these pole-sized white pine that, again, wouldn't be there. That white pine really does not like fire at all at the seedling stage. So if there was a natural fire regime, it wouldn't occur up in a site like this, where shortleaf does. But again, you can look and you're sort of in a biological desert in both places. There's virtually no diversity. There's no mid-story shrubs. There's no herb layer. You just have almost what looks like plantation forestry, except it wasn't technically planted. The two inset pictures on the left are more natural examples of dried amesic pine and pine oak forest and pine oak woodland that has been burned a lot. We have areas that get a lot of fire, and you can actually get this somewhat open condition, but it's full of amazing native plants. And then here's some examples. You were asking what species do we do? Well, here's two of them, kudzu on the upper picture and Japanese knotweed below. But those are before and after pictures. Those are in progress. But you can see the transition from kudzu covering everything to all of a sudden we've got these open rock bluffs and all kinds of interesting habitats. There's trees growing on that site now. The lower one is still a work in progress that eventually, it's right along a highway, and my intention is to eventually get that planted in a native grass and wildflower mix. So just have a pretty site on the side of the highway that will also enhance biodiversity through pollinators and those kind of things. But, just an example of that. And then, from the aquatic standpoint, I was saying aquatic restoration, we have so many streams that are just completely scoured and eroded down to bedrock. And you can see in this case, there's no connection to its floodplain anymore. It's eroding. And so the riparian habitat, that rich riparian forest that's so important adjacent to this creek really isn't getting the benefit of that anymore. And a lot of these situations are due to previous land management. These are acquired lands. A lot of this land prior to Forest Service ownership was private logging companies and farmland. So you can imagine the intense land management that's happened here. And one thing that we noticed, back to the question about old trees, there's no large trees here. And so there's no large wood. There's no large woody debris. And it's that type of structure in the streams that help build up and hold sediment and create that connection of the creek to its floodplain. So in these situations, we actually have a situation now where our aquatic biologists and our hydrologists are going out and they're doing surveys along some of these creeks, and they can reach with a piece of equipment from the road and literally put some wood into the creek in areas that we know were deficient. So just trying to kind of help some of this process along. It's really good for some of the fish habitat, and again, it makes that connection. And then with our wildlife management, again, a lot of the especially legacy land management has left a lot of scars on the landscape. If you go to any national forest, you will find a legacy of old roads that have been closed. And here's a great opportunity. While some places will still continue just to use kind of a non-native, hopefully non-invasive mix for wildlife, what we're trying to do on a lot of these now is integrate our native plant materials program into these sites and get native grasses, native forbs, which are going to be great. So you can see the small turkey in the upper left. There's anything from the game species that utilize these to a lot of interesting non-game species, but we have these types of openings all over the forest, and it's a great opportunity, and again, an obligation of ours to recognize how we can improve that. Take what we had, but make it better. And so there's just great opportunity to do that. And it's that combination then, so of protecting those rare communities and restoring those elements at the landscape level that's going to really get to resource sustainability. And that's what we're talking about here. It's not just what can I do today and then leave tomorrow, but how do we make this sustainable over time? Obviously, that kind of regulated timber harvest, that's only sustainable in the sense that you grow trees, you cut trees, you plant trees, you grow trees, you cut trees, right? That in private forestry, but we're trying to maintain habitats for rare species and have migration corridors for large all that kind of stuff. And so that needs to be a sustainable process. So knowing all that stuff now, how do we then drill this down? And so, bear with me as I go through this next bit, because I'm going to show you some maps, but I want to show you how we literally take some of this knowledge and my input into our interdisciplinary teams on the forest. How do we take this kind of knowledge and drill it down into our project level planning to make sure we're actually doing what we say we're going to do? And so, here's the example again of these prescription blocks. You can see a large area that's for bear reserve, and we've got wilderness. You see the scenic corridor following Parksville Lake and the Coe River. And then there's a large block there in the northern part that's restoration to natural communities. That's where I'm saying we have that land management prescription that within those areas, if we're doing land management, that's what we should be focusing on, which is a pretty cool thing to have in your plan. And so this restoration of dry forest communities, I was telling you, we have a lot of areas that have a lot of these off-site pines. There's other species too, but particularly Virginia pine and white pine in areas that you would typically have either shortleaf pine, pitch pine, table mountain pine, and then a variety of maybe oaks and hickories. And so there's a goal. So our forest plan has goals and objectives and standards. So goal 17 was to restore and maintain forest communities to those plant communities predicted as most likely to occur based on the ecological potential of the site. It's a mouthful. But what it's basically saying is find areas that look like they're not in good condition, and then we want to restore those to what we think the ecological potential is. And so again, how do you determine ecological potential? And we do have some modeling, but I just want to show you. So again, here's an example of a dry ridge that has Virginia pine stand on it that seems to be all one age, and there's no mid-story, there's no understory, there's nothing. I think most people would say that's probably not at its ecological potential. It's probably at its greatest potential for growing Virginia pine, but that's not what we want. And so we actually got together with a group. We formed this collaborative group. We took a broad invite to the public where we had folks from the timber industry, folks from the environmental community. This was all sort of convened by the Nature Conservancy. And we formed this collaborative of 14 people, of which I was the only Forest Service representative on. And we started brainstorming on what sorts of things could we do on the Cherokee National Forest. Where would we have agreement from everybody? And nowhere, right? You almost never get agreement. And yet everybody agreed that these dry forest communities that were completely out of whack, that are they're not providing good timber, they're not providing good ecological services, they're not providing anything towards biodiversity. We actually got really good concurrence from everybody that this would be a great place for us to try to do some restoration work on the Cherokee National Forest. So based on some recommendations from that collaborative group, I was asked to put together a proposed action on how we would utilize some silvicultural treatments, various timber harvesting techniques, but also prescribe fire, and this is really important, at its ecologically appropriate intensity, duration, and frequency to create and maintain desired conditions within these dry forests. And so we have some people that have done modeling, that have gone out on the national forest. You can go out at any point in time and drive a road and stop somewhere and look and determine what the current vegetation is, right? But a lot of times we want to know, well, what's its ecological potential? And so you find really good examples. You can go back into literature. There's a lot of information before the forest was even acquired. The timber companies kept really good records of that stuff that they were cutting. So we have a whole body of information that informs us on what we think where certain plant communities would occur on the landscape, and then you can model those. And what we did here is we actually modeled where we would find these dry forest communities. And so we only had 5 communities we're looking at here, our driest communities that are natural on the Cherokee National Forest. But then we also applied these sideboards to them, because once you're in this GIS mapping, you can do all kinds of things. And so we removed anything that was steeper than 35%, because we decided we didn't want to put mechanized equipment on slopes that were steeper than 35%, because we might create some erosion. We decided we only wanted to work in areas that were within a half mile of an existing road, because we don't want to have to build all these additional roads. And the thing is, we have a lot of roads and we have a lot of areas that are on relatively flat ground. And so this is how you find common ground amongst people that normally you wouldn't find common ground with. Well, interestingly enough, when we modeled all that, and this is just for the southern half of the Cherokee National Forest, is just circled down in the lower part there, over 62,000 acres of opportunity. That's what the model tells us, that there's over 62,000 acres of these dry forest communities that may be in need of some type of ecological restoration. Now, of course, we have to go out and ground truth those and determine what we find out there. And so again, if you're not used to looking at topo maps, this is going to look really weird, but all those colored polygons and really weird shapes, these are not typical timber harvest stands that you would see, right? This is definitely not that regulated management. But if you look at that, what those polygons are following the broad ridge tops and going out along ridges and then stopping before they get to steep ground. So especially if you look where it goes down towards the Hiwassee River, you see that where it starts getting steep, the edges of those polygons stop. And so we'll zoom in on just this little part of this. And so you can see again, now we've gone out, we take these areas, we do botanical surveys on these areas, and we determine, oh, we've got this really unique population of horse sugar, Symplochus tinctoria, which is a viability concern species for this part of the state, and a small orchid site that was up in that upper area. So now we know we've got these areas that we've ground truth that have a lot of incursion of these pine species that really shouldn't be there, but we also have some intact good stuff that we want to maintain there. And so we take all of that information and we build it into this proposal on how we're going to take stands that, these are the extremes. Again, imagine these are stands that are like almost monocultures, but we have a lot of stands where you have patches of this within a more intact. And so this whole project is designed at trying to remove this stuff from the landscape, but enhancing and maintaining the part that we have that meets the good condition. And so again, we want stands that look more like this. If we're in our dry forest communities, these are examples of a healthy, you've got downed wood, you've got older trees, all the different facets that make up a good dry forest community. And what we definitely want to move from is, if you're dealing with this where you've got no diversity at all, we want to open it up and at a minimum create some situation where you can get some of that grass forb and other things that are growing in there. And then you start finding species like this. Most of those are common species. There's one rare one down there in the lower left, but they all occur in these habitats. And it's really, these are the types of things, again, we can really enhance native biodiversity by doing this type of work. And by the way, we're still meeting some of the timber harvest goals, because in order to do this, we removed some large diameter white pine from areas where it really wasn't appropriate on the landscape anyway. Again, so I'm about to shift over into some of the non-natives, so I'll just pause real quickly and see if anyone has any questions on any of that.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat box, so if anybody has a question, they can say it out loud. Oh, we've got one here. Let's see. Our forests have suffered the loss or threatened loss of major keystone species in the past 100 or so years. Chestnut from a blight, pines from beetles, ash, the emerald ash borer, hemlock, woolly adelgid, maybe oak with the sudden oak death. What trees will we have left? Is this even more concerning than the loss of rare species?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack in that question, but so hemlock woolly adelgid. I always tell people, I grew up hearing about chestnut and the passenger pigeon, right? And so because it happened really before I was old enough to really be thinking about what a forest dominated by chestnut and having these huge flocks of pigeons flying through would be like, it seemed like one day you got chestnut and then they're just gone. I mean, that's the way it appears. And yet we are watching that happen to hemlocks. There's been, the hemlock woolly adelgid has been really decimating hemlocks across the region. And it's weird to see areas where hemlock mortality is happening and wondering, will we lose that species? And I guess the positive light on that and any of them is that the technology is just, we know a lot more now. And so there are groups that have been collecting hemlock seed. They're looking for resistance. There's all kinds of things. We have a pretty aggressive treatment. There was a whole environmental assessment that was done across a couple of national forests that looked at core areas on trying to hold ground and protect the hemlocks. And so we still have some areas with some pretty healthy hemlocks on the forest, but it's, again, the question of sustainability. They're only going to stay there as long as we keep the adelgids off of them. And so there's got to be a different solution. And yeah, I think it's scary when you start seeing things like emerald ash borer and all these others that are on the move. I mean, it ties right into this. Some of those tie right into this non-native invasive plant species problem I'm about to talk about. I think the interesting one, the southern pine beetle, in some way, in my mind, now a forester is going to disagree with me, but the southern pine beetle did us some favors in some regards on parts of the Cherokee National Forest, because those monocultures of Virginia pine I was showing you, that's a smorgasbord for southern pine beetle. Southern pine beetle is a native insect that kind of cycles around. It's not an invasive, and it has it cycles through kind of these breakouts. I think it's something like every 7 years or so. When you have a healthy, intact forested system where pine is a component but not a monoculture, you can afford some pine mortality without it completely changing the landscape. When we had the big pine beetle infestation, I can't remember now how many years ago that was here, 10 or 15 years ago, it caused mass mortality. But it's because we had so many stands that weren't healthy, that were monoculture Virginia pine stands. I'm trying to deal with some of those through restoration by using timber harvest and fire and all these other things I was talking about. But quite honestly, some of those areas that became dead stands due to pine beetle were actually, once the trees started dying and falling, we started seeing native Indian grass and some of the native species that were in the seed bank coming up. So I know there were people that were kind of bummed out about the loss of timber value from the pine beetle, and yes, it also affected our some of the other things like shortleaf and the other species. But those monoculture Virginia pine stands, when pine beetle got them, I wasn't crying too much. So it's a good question, and we have, I guess that's why I was saying this is such an important concept for us all to be thinking about, is that there are so many external pressures on forests and just public lands in general. And so you can't ignore those. And if we do, we are going to lose these things over time. But I feel like, we're doing a good job, and a lot of it comes through public education and just getting an educated public that can advocate for these types of things as well. I mean, that's actually one of the most important things we can do, and it's probably one of the things that always motivates me to give these talks on either this or an invasive species or anything, because things don't change until the public really wants it to change. And we have the power. And so, I just think it's really important that an educated public be able to speak out and comment intelligently on what's happening on public lands, so that we can make the right decisions.
Absolutely. I think we're with you there on that issue for sure. We're coming up on 7 o'clock. Did you have any more slides for us?
Yeah, I guess by taking questions in the middle, we've slowed this down. I do have a little bit to run through, if that's okay. I'll just
yeah. No, we don't have to end at exactly 7. I just wanted you to know what time it was.
I don't think there's too much more, but I was just going to go through this non-native invasive plant species and the impacts they have. And
that'd be great.
Yeah, I'm not going to read through all this, but I always ask people, because I give a lot of talks at like the local community college and others, and one of the first questions I ask is, why do we care? Like, why do we care about invasives? And quite frankly, sometimes people will say, I don't. And my goal is always by the end of the talk to get them to care. And there's any number of reasons. And, there's all this infestation that happens, but whether or not it's a financial thing that, you're losing your crop to it, or maybe you're a hunter or a fisherman and you've lost your favorite site, or you're a recreation person and this used to be your favorite trail, but now you can't get through there. There's plenty of reasons. I think you can find a reason why everybody should care about these big infestations of non-native invasives. And locally, it's estimated 9% of our southern forests have infestation. I told you I had this decision tree earlier about invasives. We can't treat everything. And so really simply, you look at this and is the species new to the forest? Have we ever seen it before? If the answer is yes, you go down and says, well, can it spread rapidly in one season? If the answer is yes to that, then let's take care of it. Like, let's get rid of that right now before it becomes a problem, right? And you can kind of follow down these other thought processes, but it's basically, this is a form of triage. On the other side, do we even have funding? Well, if we do, can it spread rapidly in one season? That's always going to be something I'm looking at. What's its potential to act? Why do I need to act right now? And then does it have close proximity to a unique area of natural community, rare species site, high public interest, something like that? And so what that's really doing is using that concept you've heard, early detection, rapid response, right? We need to find things early and take care of them quickly before they become a problem. And so I won't go through all this whole thing, but this was a study that we did, and I just want to show you an example. This was a study we did back from the year 2000, or 1998 to 2000, where we had this large kudzu patch, and it was adjacent to a stream, but we wanted to use what was then a relatively new herbicide, Transline, which is, it's not legume specific. It definitely is very good on legumes, but it's a targeted herbicide, so it doesn't have as many effects on the other native species that would occur there. And so we did this whole study, and at the time, they were also sampling water quality and all these kind of things to make sure that we weren't having any adverse effect on anything else with these treatments. The good story with that was there was nothing that was detected that caused any problem to macroinvertebrates and all these different things in the creek. And here's what we started with. We had this large kudzu patch. I have that red arrow pointing to a little cement structure just so for reference. But we went through and did these Transline applications. This was July of 1998. They cut all the vines. They treated the foliage. They came back later in that year and retreated. It looked like, got a kind of a top kill, but by the next year, it's all coming back. So they did the treatments again. And finally, they went through there and then they burned it and they planted native grass and forbs. And that's the same site. And so I'm not a huge advocate. I don't like using herbicides, to be honest with you. But if you use them carefully, if you're following label rates and you're really careful about what you do with very targeted applications, we do a lot of just like direct like cut stump treatment where we're just putting a little bit of active ingredient directly on the target. So there's virtually no chance of offsite. But I think we can pretty well agree that this site now, from a biodiversity standpoint, these are all native plants that were put in here, is certainly going to be a better situation than when it was a complete kudzu patch. Just a couple other examples. This is down by the Conasauga River. An example of early detection. Found this little bit of kudzu runner. Had never seen kudzu down there before. It's growing, so we think, okay, no big deep root system. Maybe we can knock this out. One treatment, rapid response, it's gone. These other sites like this one and the first one where you have these big tubers is a little bit harder, but this you can see kudzu all the way up the bank here, before, after. A success story, you were talking about some of the natives. This is a site, again, you look across the top, you can see that it's so typical. Kudzu just, it's a curtain. It's all the way from ground to tops of trees. It was treated multiple times. And now that site, we still have to go by and find kudzu sprigs. If you look at the middle picture, there's kudzu growing right next to that trillium. But that's Trillium decumbens. That's a very rare species for Tennessee. It's common to our south, but it's only known in Tennessee and Polk County. And so how that thing was still persistent. One of the interesting things about kudzu is that it's one of the last things to green up. I don't know if you ever noticed that, but it'll be May and it still is just barely putting on leaves. Some of these early spring things can actually, they have a big, like a trillium, a big bulb underground. It actually comes up photosynthesizes, does its thing, and then gets covered up by kudzu. So these, I think, persisted on the site, but now we've freed them up, and you have a lot of natives there as well. The last thing I wanted to talk about, how do we, what's another way of like, what do we do with some of these sites after we've dealt with the native or the invasive species, or we're doing like that timber management, we're going in there and we're removing some of the offsite pine and other stuff, but there's still ground disturbance. And traditionally the Forest Service has gone in there and planted whatever the cheapest seed was. It's just what, you know, it's what people do. It's what highway departments do. You go to the seed supply company and you get fescue or something like that, and you plant a bunch of it. We don't do that. We haven't done that now for years. And we developed this native plant materials program on the forest, where we reached out and we determined between myself and my similar person that works with me on over on the National Forest of North Carolina, we found 11 species of grasses and forbs that were common to these 5 different southern Appalachian national forests. So these are species that you can find across the southern Appalachian region. And then we got collection sites on all of those forests. So we're collecting various genotypes from different areas, brought them together and grow them in common gardens to see if you would have dramatic change. Because what you don't want to do is take a species that's used to blooming in June and moving it to a place where, you know, that same species native would bloom at a different time. So we did all these common garden studies. We came up with really no significant difference in these species. And so here's what we have now. We have these 11 species growing commercially at Roundstone Seed that you can now buy as a Southern Appalachian ecotype seed. And the interesting thing is, so I showed you those wildlife openings. This is the type of stuff we plant. And that one kind of in the middle, Baptisia tinctoria, that's the host plant for a rare butterfly, the frosted elfin, which is in decline in this area. So by using these native species now, we can go out into these areas that were previously an old logging road, and we can enhance it with native species and, in fact, the native host plants for the declining pollinators. And so this is, again, it's the cycle of really moving towards a full understanding of biodiversity on the landscape and how you bring it all around to manage for sustainability. These are just some real quick examples. This is Roundstone Seed and some of our stuff that's growing out there. It's just a super cool thing. Commercially available Southern Appalachian ecotype seed. So we know that the genetics and the bloom times and all those kind of things are appropriate for this region, which is a really difficult thing to find. A lot of native seed you can buy might come from the Midwest. You know, a lot of these same species, a lot of the grass species that we're growing here also grow in the Great Plains, but they're not the same genetic makeup, and it's really not a great idea to necessarily move them here. So what we're doing is using commercially available Appalachian ecotype seed, which we're pretty proud of. The very last bit, we're also doing the same thing with live plugs. We put out contracts to local nurseries. They come and collect seed for certain species that I identify I want. They collect that seed on the forest, they grow it out in their greenhouses, and they provide the live plants back to me for the exact same purpose, so we can actually go in and put live plugs in the ground. Here's an example. Look at the road scar on the upper left. That same road scar, I've got an arrow pointing to the tree, is shown in the picture to the right. That's now been recontoured. So some kind of land management, timber harvest was done in there. That road was completely decommissioned and recontoured. And now we have the ability not only to do that, but to replant it with native seed and live plugs if we so want to. So really trying to do the right thing on the ground. We use a lot of the native plants also in our admin sites. I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense to preach about not using invasive species when you go to most ranger stations and you can see them growing in their front yard, right? So we're trying to convert and do a lot of this stuff and use the natives in our own landscaping. And this is the Bradley County Master Gardeners group that I have an agreement with that come out and help me maintain the beds at the Whitewater Center using those very live plugs that we grow. And so I'll leave you with this, and that doing what's right is not always the easiest path, but it's certainly the right path to take. I get told by a lot of people, well, we can't do that, that's hard. It's like, then that's probably why we should be doing it, because management to protect biodiversity is in fact the right path. So I know I went a little bit over, but hopefully that was something that was meaningful to y'all. I've got my email contact up there if people can feel free to reach out to me for additional resources, but I'm happy to take any additional questions anyone might have at this point.
That was great, Mark. Thank you so much. Yes, very meaningful to the wild ones. Absolutely. I feel like, one of the main tenets of this group is that we see any green space, right? Backyards in urban environments as an opportunity to support wildlife and do good for the environment. So great stuff. We had one question asking, where could they get the seed mix you're describing? And an answer was Roundstone seed. And we've actually purchased that for city property. So it's really exciting to see that for sale. And one of the questions was, does buying that seed have a benefit to the Forest Service? Do you guys, is there like a donation built into that or anything?
No, but the benefit is this, because I had long conversations when we first did it. It was a contract with Roundstone Seed to get them to take on the opportunity. But the idea was that if it works, then they end up with this commercial entity that they can a product. But they're only going to keep growing that stuff if people are buying it, right? I mean, it's just pure economics. A seed company is going to sell what people want to buy, and that's what I was saying. So the education component is so critical. If nobody buys Southern Appalachian ecotype seed, they're going to say, we've got all these production fields that are just taking up space, and they're going to plant something else. The good news is, we've reached out over time, with TWRA, Tennessee, Wildlife Resources and others. Once people are aware that this exists, I think it is being utilized quite a bit. So that's what I was saying. I mean, the educated public thing, I tell people about invasives, you can go down to most hardware, home improvement stores and buy Japanese honeysuckle in a gallon pot. A lot of those things are there. And when I tell you, I talk to these community colleges, and when I ask them, why should you care? And some of them say, well, I don't care. And by the end of the class, they're ready to go down and start protesting outside of, the local Home Depot. And what I tell them though is like, yeah, I mean, if you're providing information to people, that's one thing, but really the best thing you can do is just keep talking about it and go in and ask them, why I want to get this particular native honeysuckle for my yard, because I promise you, those places will not sell Japanese honeysuckle anymore if nobody's buying it. And that's where I really feel like, we have the power as people to make that kind of change. You can try to regulate it all you want, and that just gets people angry. Honestly, when we try to regulate, if the government tries to regulate a private business, people don't like to hear that. But if the private business is regulated by the consumer, and if they're not going to purchase that, if they're not going to purchase the invasives, they won't sell them anymore. And just likewise, if nobody wants to buy the native seed, they won't produce it anymore either. So I think it's just really important to get folks to really understand that and to carry that message. It's what will make the change, I think.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing with us today and getting the word out there like you're talking about. And we're just so glad that we could hear from you. And this has been recorded, so it's going to be on our Tennessee Valley Wild Ones YouTube channel, and we'll continue to get the word out.
All right, well, that was my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks so much, Mark. I could listen to this all day.
I know, right?
Yeah, I'm like, well, it doesn't matter if we end at 7. He can talk as long as he wants.
Yeah, I've definitely got more questions, but
very enjoyable.
Yeah.
Well, like I said, feel free to send an email or share my email for folks that might have additional questions. But yeah, I mean, you guys control the time, but I'm obviously happy to answer any questions people have on the immediate content that I shared. So
thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming. Yeah, this is where I miss the green spaces venue where you can kind of hang around for a minute afterward and touch base with everybody. And but yeah, thanks again.
Yeah,
Maybe it won't be too long before we can do that again.
I'm hoping.
Yeah.
Like we're turning the corner, but we'll see.
So where is your
Yes.
office? Where are you usually located, Mark?
Our supervisor's office is in Cleveland, Tennessee. So the Cherokee National Forest spans, I probably should have said something about that. Folks don't know, but so the extreme, if you go like the eastern border, starting at Georgia and then going north until you hit the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The park spans both North Carolina and Tennessee, but it's Park Service. But then north of the park, again, following the Tennessee North Carolina border, basically until you hit Virginia, most of that narrow strip of mountains is Cherokee National Forest on the Tennessee side. So we have roughly 650,000 acres. And so we're broken into two zones. We refer to the North Zone, everything that's north of the Smokies, and the South Zone. But in those zones that we have basically 4 ranger districts. So there's 4 different district offices. And then our supervisor's office is down here in Cleveland. And that's kind of unique in the sense, usually on a lot of forests, the supervisor's office would be as centrally located as possible so that, we have access to the more parts of the forest. So, you might think Knoxville, but it's just, I'm not sure how it came to be, but we're kind of the southernmost office. So it takes a while, if I'm going up to a district meeting in Johnson City,
Yeah.
I'm driving 3 hours one way. So, 6 hours to go to a meeting if it's just a day thing. So geographically, it's kind of, we're a really long and narrow forest. And like I said, and then a lot of in holdings and private, roads going east-west through it. So a lot of fragmentation, which ties into that whole nature of how important these lands really are and those external pressures. It's just, it sounds like a big area, but it's broken up and it has a lot of edge.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of edge. Whew, that's fascinating. I work in the water quality program, so I was hoping to pick your brain about. I have to. Christina's like, there she goes.
No, it's great. Go on.
A huge part of my job is linking native plants to water quality, just helping people understand that healthy land, healthy forests. That's how you manage water, and watersheds are made of land. So I've tried to find like studies or kind of direct evidence of, well, when your riparian area is full of invasives, maybe there's erosion problems. How does it change the soil? Obviously you have a drop in biodiversity. There's just a cascade of issues that go with that. But directly linking is sometimes hard, even for my own administration. It's well, why are you spending so much time on plants? You're supposed to be a water person.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I do point out in a couple of in that why do we care thing, in my sort of extended version of that, one of the ones I mentioned is water quality. And kudzu was originally brought here for erosion. Right? But if you ever looked under a kudzu patch, it's all gullied and, it doesn't put out fine roots. It has these long, deep tubers. And so water flow and erosion occurs underneath kudzu patches. And so where you have kudzu, especially that's going right down to the creek, I'm sure that you're getting sediment and issues like that. Ailanthus is, I don't know if you know ailanthus. It's, what's the common name of that? It's all over. I mean, it's been planted all over the place. Tree of Heaven, yeah. And it's allelopathic. And so when it's dropping leaves, it's creating bare space so that it can spread. And again, so you're getting erosion. If you have large ailanthus areas, you're probably getting erosion under those as well. But yeah, just all of I think, anytime, I think privet is, which is really, really, it occurs more than just in riparian areas. I have a whole bunch of it on my back fence, and I don't have any water back there. But it's rampant in riparian areas, and it grows so densely again that it literally excludes any kind of herbaceous growth underneath it. And while it kind of has a few fibrous roots, if you ever try to yank one of those things out of the ground, it's mostly big, deep, tough roots. And so, it's the smaller plants that with the real fibrous roots that are holding that bank together and that are holding the integrity of that riparian soil. So I think there's any number. I mean, whether those are published or not, I think you can certainly go out and see it, and just, it's there. And so there's so many detrimental. I was just watching something today where there's this argument, even some fairly prominent ecologists that are sort of throwing their hands in the air saying, yeah, you know what, a lot of these things are just naturalized. It just happens. Things move, and we just need to let it be, and it'll all come. And it's like, I get that to some extent, but I also, where it's causing an immediate problem, and I mean, I just feel like we have the ability to do something about it.
Absolutely. And preventing the spread to new places like you were talking about, and prioritizing, is it new to the park? I think that was a great decision tree tool.
Well, and it's funny, like, again, in that when I do the invasive species one, I'll show these range maps. And so Japanese honeysuckle for vines is one of the most widespread and rapidly spreading species. And it covers the entire Southeast. The Cherokee National Forest is right in the heart of its range. So I'll ask the community college kids, if you were asked, I always tell them, first of all, you got to have a strategy. Are you trying to eradicate? Are you trying to control? Or are you trying to prevent? So get rid of it completely, just control it where it is, or prevent it from ever getting here. So I'll show them the range map and then drop a pin on it and show the Cherokee National Forest and say, okay, you've just been assigned to work on Japanese honeysuckle at this site right here. What's your strategy? And they're like, would you even do it? I mean, that's sort of like parachuting. Would you
even do it?
Fire, right? That you're not going to parachute into the middle of the blaze. And yet, what I show them is that, so in a lot of cases, I'm not going to treat Japanese honeysuckle on the National Forest because it's everywhere. But if I have Japanese honeysuckle that's threatening something, if I've got an endangered species site and it's about to get covered up by Japanese honeysuckle, or I have a scenic area, there are times when it makes sense to treat it. And so, but you just have to realize then that you're just sort of holding ground. And so you've eradicated it, or at least managed it from a particular site, and now you're going to hold ground on that site. And so, sadly, I would say, you saw we've done tremendous things with kudzu on this forest. We have areas that were just complete kudzu patches that now you'd never know there was kudzu there, and there's all kinds of cool biodiversity, and pollinators, all kinds of stuff going on these slopes. And yet, I sadly would say that there's probably more kudzu today in this country than there was yesterday. And there'll be more kudzu tomorrow. And so there are people that would argue, then you're just wasting your time. Why are you treating kudzu? And I'm like, well, I don't have any jurisdiction over the entire United States, but I do on the Cherokee National Forest. And if I can make a difference and really hold ground and create some real value to wildlife and rare plants and all that kind of stuff here, then that feels pretty good. And I think it's pretty good justification to do it. And I think, honestly, from the invasive species management part, that's one of our biggest weaknesses in this country, is that we have different policies depending on where you're standing. Even, municipalities, parks, forests, cities, some places care, some people don't care. And so it doesn't do me a lot of good to be managing invasives on my property if right next to me someone's planting them and it's going to keep dumping seed in, right? And so we actually get into agreements. A lot of those kudzu patches we've treated on the forest and others, we get into these land use agreements with the adjacent landowner that allows us to actually expend federal dollars on private land for the benefit of the whole. And most people, when I start to, it's called the Wyden. It's a Wyden amendment. When I approach people that at first are like, I don't want the federal government coming on my property. And then you're like, well, do you want this kudzu on your property? Like, nah, I'd love to get rid of that. I'm like, well, we're actually willing to do that for you if you're willing to grant access for us to do it, because it's in everybody's best interest to treat the whole patch, not half the patch.
Absolutely. I mean, we
That
have
would be
the,
fantastic to
yeah,
happen in Chattanooga.
we have the exact
You know what I'm
same
saying?
problems in
Different
Chattanooga city parks.
yeah, different jurisdictions, you know, that's a federal thing, so we're able to do that. But then I get people saying, "Hey, can you come do that on my property?" I'm like, "Well, you're not adjacent to the national forest, so no." But you know, it was good of you to ask. But you see, it's really it's crazy that we don't have because we don't have any real comprehensive policy that's looking at the issue holistically. We have to deal with it piece by piece, and that's why what I'm saying I've gotten comfortable with saying, yeah, I can't control the problem. Yeah, there's going to be more kudzu tomorrow, but I can sure make a difference on what I'm doing right here today.
Yeah, I have about 11 acres just across the street from me that's covered in kudzu that I continually try to keep out of my own yard.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's funny if you look at typical highway management, there's about a 30-foot swath, right, where they'll go along and just spray along their right of way, and they do that every year. And that kudzu patch might not really go that far up the slope, but they're going to spend the money on chemical and spraying for the rest of their eternity with that stuff
Instead
on
of
the
actually
But if
eradicating
they
it.
just went one time
Yep.
and did what it takes, of course, you're not going to get rid of it in one treatment, but you can't, like, if they spent the time and energy to really take care of the whole thing and then spend some time maintaining that, they would no longer need to worry about it. And I would have to think that the cost, if you did that cost comparison, it makes sense to treat it now. But it, like I said, it's just not the way things are done. And so, you know, I'm thankful that we at least have that ability to treat on adjacent lands with landowner permission.
Yeah, I think that's great. Lynn, I don't think the city sprays really at all, do they?
Oh yeah.
Do we?
Oh man.
Spray kudzu?
We spray, yeah. I mean, some of it is state roads, but the city definitely sprays in the right of way, and they spray in riparian areas. We're not on the same
Okay.
page, our city divisions,
Mm-mm.
as far as how to safely do that. But yeah, so the city of Chattanooga doesn't have a single person with the title of botanist or ecologist. So to say to be able to look at a kudzu patch on the side of the road and assess that and say, if we come, 2 or 3 visits, we could eradicate this and you wouldn't have to spray anymore. That cost savings and that assessment just don't exist in the city because we have not prioritized vegetation, right? It's not valued. The value's unknown. So we have a city forester, but really again and again, we come back to this conclusion that we just have to communicate the value of actually knowing these plants and their behavior and how to work with them. It's just something our city doesn't get yet.
Well, I think one of the challenges too is that, just to be transparent, if you've had a kudzu patch that's been around 50 years or more, super long-lived seed. I mean, the seed just, it lasts forever. And this really deep root system. And so we have a lot of areas on the Cherokee that we've treated, over the years that, like I said, if you drive by them, you'd never know there was kudzu there. But we still have to go back at least every other year or so and check for new sprouts. And because there's so much seed in the seed bank, and even those big, huge roots, it is hard to kill it. And so I think, over time, but I think that's the part that really frustrates people is that they want to be one and done.
Yeah.
That's why I showed that first example. You go there and it looks like you killed it. And by the next year, it looks like you did nothing. And that frustrates people. So they walk away from it. But I've got some slides where I do it where you kind of have the PowerPoint and the effect where it just kind of peels a curtain back and taking a picture at best you can of the same place at the same scale, so it literally looks like the kudzu just peeling off the tree. But it's amazing to look at an area and have someone look at it and say, and then show them the picture of what it used to look like when there was kudzu there, and they're like in disbelief because they think, number one, that in order to get rid of the kudzu, you would have literally had to kill everything else as well. And that's what I'm saying. I mean, you can do targeted herbicide application that really I mean, honestly, people do more damage with what they put on their lawns in an urban environment than we would ever come close to doing with active ingredient on the national forest. We're really, really careful and super regulated about what we do. So people get all freaked out thinking, oh, the Forest Service is using herbicides. And I promise you, I mean, right here in Cleveland, Tennessee, probably my neighborhood puts more chemical into, by putting the stuff they put on their yards than we do in a year of
Yeah,
national forest management.
for sure.
Yeah, and there's studies about that too, just the homeowner versus a trained
Misuse.
professional. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I help
Absolutely.
manage a park up here near me, and we have so much kudzu. I would love for the city to come spray it. Yeah, it's something we've tried to get eradicated for a while, but it keeps coming in.
Yeah. Well, the restoration part, I mean, like you were saying, like targeted spraying, actually zeroing in on what plants you're actually trying to get rid of and saving the good stuff, right? The good stuff is going to help you prevent more weeds from coming in. I feel like this is something that gets lost a lot is learning how to kill stuff, which we do workshops and we have certificate in native plant classes about invasive management, but thinking about what you're actually, the end goal is restoration. So how do you minimize the impact on the soil throughout the whole process? How do you minimize the impact to the desirable vegetation?
Yeah, you got to think about all that up
Yeah,
front because
just
I think
every step.
a lot of people, yeah, if you treat invasives and get rid of it and leave it bare soil there, you're going to get just another invasive. I don't know how many times we've like removed kudzu only to find like periwinkle or something else underneath. I mean, it just invasives beget
There's the next wave.
and so, yeah, I mean, that's why I think like that native plant materials program that we have is so critical. I have a whole process that we put together for the forest on what we do when we have disturbed soil. Because like in the old day, I mean, you would go out and, hydroseed whatever cheap mix you could find. And a lot of that, it wasn't necessarily invasive, but it was definitely non-native. Some of those things are invasive, but being able to say, okay, when we have, here's a mix that Southern Appalachian ecotype mix, they sell two mixes. You can buy the individual species if you just want them plant by, species by species, but we have one that's designed as kind of a mesic area mix and one that's xeric. And so in there, you saw the grasses, there was a Dicanthelium clandestinum, which is deer tongue, which you find a lot in riparian areas. And so we're trying to say if you're going to disturb soil along an area that's shady or moist and shady, use this mesic mix. And if you're going to be up on just a cut bank, and the other thing, those species that's where they were collected from. We were looking specifically what grows on dry cut banks, right? Because you don't want to try to put stuff there that's not going to grow, and you don't want to suddenly see things there that are out of place. So every one of those species that were in that mix, at least on these Southern Appalachian forests, are really common roadside species. So when instead of like, if you did a road project, you have this big exposed bank and now you plant fescue all over it, or, heaven forbid, like they used to do Sericia lespedeza or something, it's really obvious that something was planted there and it's not normal. If we're planting these natives, over time, it just looks natural. And that's what we're striving for. So that's what I was saying. It's kind of this full circle. I look at our land management and say, how do we do this in a way that we can really leave minimal impact on the landscape? And we are a land management agency, and we do have, congressionally designated things they want us to do, like producing a certain amount of timber and all these different things. That, like I said, that multiple use is difficult, and it's difficult to do that and still have a natural appearing landscape, and yet I think I feel really good about what we're doing on the Cherokee National Forest in the sense that we're getting there. And that's like, I love that emerging landscape component because it's a good visual. Do you want, what do you want the landscape that's emerging after your action to look like? Do you want it to look like a subdivision, or do you want it to look like a national forest should look like? And I want it to look like a national forest. Anyway,
That's great. Well, I'm so glad you could hang around a minute, Mark. This has just really been a pleasure. And yeah, I'm a big fan of your work. I love the Cherokee
too.
National Forest. And thanks for sharing all this with us today.
sure.
Yes, it was fantastic. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, we'll do it again sometime, hopefully in person.
Yeah,
That'd be
I'd
nice.
love to keep in touch.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Take care.
Thanks
Thank
again.
you all.
Yep. Bye-bye.